When the COVID pandemic led to virtual schooling, parents got to look into their children's classrooms, many for the first time, and many were horrified by what they saw. Pornographic sex education, gender confusion, critical race theory, and all taking the place of reading, writing, and arithmetic. How did we get here? Well, in a new report titled From the Top, the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty took a deeper dive into what future teachers are being taught in the Wisconsin State University system. They found dozens of examples of far-left indoctrination included in the required materials just to get a teaching degree. And joining me now to discuss his findings and what this means for our children's education is Dr. Will Flanders. He's the research director at the Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty. Dr. Will, thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me on.
Well, we're glad to have you. There's a lot to unpack here. Let's bottom line it, and then we'll work our way backwards. What did you discover about the influence universities are having on America's future teachers?
Yeah, so you're right that there's a huge amount of liberal indoctrination going on. And I think the key point to realize is that, when we're looking for the origins of the stuff that we are seeing in our classrooms today, what we're learning here is it's not just teachers organically coming up with this stuff themselves. They're not unilaterally going out on a limb and finding materials that are sort of contrary to what they've been taught. Instead, it's a process that's been going on for years and years throughout their entire education. And we found it across every university in the state, every public university in the state that has an education program. We found the same sort of message being taught at all of the universities.
Okay, now tell us, what research did you do? How did you find this that led to those conclusions?
Yeah, so we're a law and policy center, so we have a good ability to do wide open records requests. And what we did is we open records requested every syllabus for required classes for each university in the state, and that was 14 different universities. And we did get results back. We can at least give them credit for following through on the open records request, despite the controversial stuff that was included. We were able to get responses from each university, looked through them, sort of culled them. We had some other researchers on staff. I'll credit Dylan Palmer, who was a research assistant over the summer, did a lot of the groundwork here looking through these materials. And we pulled out not every example. There's even more in there than what's listed in our report, but a ton of the most controversial examples that we ran across and put them out there for the world to see.
And I want you to tell us about some of those. What were the most controversial examples? What did you see that led you to believe that really this is an orchestrated effort to get the teachers and then send them out into the schools?
Yeah, so I think the stuff that you would think would be there is what we found, unfortunately. We found a good amount of CRT. The left and opponents like to say this stuff is not being taught in school, but that's absolutely not the case. We found books like Anti-Racist Baby being required at the UW Stevens Point. We found a number of different texts that sort of set up this critical race theory narrative that individuals can't achieve on their own. They're sort of subjected to the race that they're born with, and they can't succeed in life if they come from a certain background. We also found a lot of controversial stuff in regard to LGBTQ+. We found materials that suggested not only do you have to treat students with respect, and I think that's a reasonable goal, but we need to be promoting this in classrooms as young as 3-year-olds. And that was in one of these textbooks, that we should be promoting LGBTQ agenda in the 3-year-old classroom on campus. That was one of the more horrifying findings that we had. But any litany of things that you would think would be in sort of the liberal checklist of things they'd like to see in schools, it's being taught from freshman all the way to senior year.
We're talking to Dr. Will Flanders from the Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty. And Will, you mentioned some of the books that were included in some of these syllabi that you looked over. Was this required? Is this something where students could get a teaching degree without doing this, but by choosing particular classes, they would have some of this? Or is this something that everyone in these degree programs was required to walk through?
Now, that's a great point to emphasize here. These were the vast majority in required classes. We did pull a few electives, but all of the stuff that I just mentioned to you right now were from the required classes. So it's not as if this is just an agenda for a teacher who happens to be a liberal and wants to move in that direction. Yeah. Teachers from any background that want to become an educator in the state of Wisconsin are going through the vast majority of these courses without any alternatives that are available. These are the required list of classes.
Now, you mentioned some of these problematic classes that deal with sensitive LGBTQ issues or critical race theory. Would a student going through these programs have to take one of these, two of these? What's the degree of saturation that they experience in these programs?
An interesting question. We sort of focused on the classes that seem most likely to have these sorts of materials in place. But I think the reality is, as we see at the university level as a whole, there was a poll in 2020 that 48% of teachers identified as Democrats and only 6% identified as Republicans. That's university-wide. So even if these teaching candidates are taking classes in other fields, if they're taking their history classes in the history department, it's likely that this stuff is pervasive across the board. And we could only do a small sample. We got a lot of material, but it's still a small sample from each university. But it's likely that almost every class that a teacher is in, or a prospective teacher is in, they're going to be seeing some of this stuff.
Yeah. Will, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is because I feel like I have a personal long history with this, because my wife and I are alums of a different UW, of the University of Washington from Seattle. And my wife got her master's degree in education at the University of Washington. And I was watching that process, and we're now about 20 years out from this. But she, at one point, and we had this genuine conflict with one of her professors because she was required to write a paper on the ways in which she was a victim and the ways in which she had victimized others. And the assignment gave her this long list of isms and racism and sizeism and, ageism, all the isms that we know about. And she was required to identify with some of them and then talk about all the ways in which she had done that. And her initial reaction essentially was, I don't really consider myself to be a victim. And that was found to be an unacceptable answer. And so the professor said she cannot pass the class until you answer you complete the assignment on the merits. And I raised that because this is a couple decades ago almost. And so my question is, long lead up here is, do you have a sense for how long this has been happening in the university system? So how long has it been, to borrow a Reagan term, trickling down into our education system?
Yeah, great question. I think, while I think it's gotten worse, and I think the left has become more emboldened in recent years, I think you're absolutely right. Even before we saw sort of this pervasive CRT culture nationwide across our culture, it came from the university system, right? The first CRT theories were propagated in the 1970s. And so this stuff has been going on at the university level for a long time. I also went through a teacher prep in Georgia back about 15 years ago at this point. And some of this stuff was even there then. And that was sort of the impetus for thinking we should look into this, because I knew, you have a teacher who may come into the field and, have a sort of system of moral beliefs that's absolutely consistent with the community that they're coming from. But when you're inculcated in this environment for 4 years, a lot of potential teachers don't have the sort of baseline knowledge to even know that they're being indoctrinated. So, your wife was fortunate that, she has that understanding to know what's going on. A lot of teachers may be teaching this stuff and learning this stuff without even knowing that it's a particular liberal ideology that's sort of being forced and indoctrinated into them.
Yeah. Now, Will, it seems there's an opportunity cost to education. And if this is a priority in our education schools, training our teachers, do we have any sense of the things that they are no longer learning? Is there a loss in some more substantive subject matters that our teachers have because it's been replaced with all of this DEI stuff?
Yeah, I think we absolutely see that to be the case. At least, certainly we see it in the results that we see in schools, right? Across the country, we see NAEP scores, so scores on math and reading tests that are stagnating. Here in our own state of Wisconsin, we had record low performance on our forward exam, which is our state exam here in Wisconsin. So as you say, it's a fixed pie. There's a set amount of hours in the day and a set amount of classes that a teacher is taking. And inevitably, some of that content is being replaced by this sort of material that really is not related directly to what they're supposed to be teaching, but takes up that time. And we see the results in schools that are seeing declining performance relative to where they were a decade ago.
Yeah. And again, anecdotally, when I recall the time that I was vicariously going through a master's in education program with my wife, she would end up proofreading a lot of her cohorts material. And I was shocked at the inability to just construct paragraphs. And these are people who had already finished their undergrad degrees and they were in a master's program. And I was horrified by just the basic grammar ability to make an argument in writing, yet they were all getting their master's degree. They all completed it successfully, and they understood the answers to these other questions that seemed to be, in fairness at that point, the real priority of the program. But you've described kind of the way that this has been operating holistically from the university system down to the lower education system. But do you have any sense that this was, is this being masterminded anywhere? Is there some, puppet master behind the curtain controlling all the universities? Is this happening organically? How did this situation develop?
So I think, it's a complex question, right? There's a lot of different components that have contributed to this. I think when we think about the university environment and the sort of pervasive ideology in the university environment as a whole, it's sort of inevitable that it makes it into the education department as well. So while there are, the sort of founders of the CRT narrative and, those folks sort of that belief system trickled down, I think it is to some extent, and it's more problematic because this is the case, it is somewhat organic in that developed among the left-wing faculty at universities across the country. So while there is money behind it and there are folks that are heavily pushing the narrative, I think it's definitely the case that we're seeing this stuff pop up even in places that are sort of disconnected from that, even at small rural universities that might have very little connection to those, those larger universities. It's pervasive across the board because I think it sort of fits with the politically correct narrative that these schools want to push, and that's what makes it even harder to fight.
Yeah. Will, based on your research and what you've kind of learned about the system and the way this is operating, what advice do you give to parents who have students in this system?
Yeah, so Will, our organization as well, I'm Will Flanders. They call me Flanders at the office to avoid confusion, but our organization is currently working on a project that's known as Restoring American Education. And the goal is here, parents have seen behind the curtain, as you said in your intro, we need the alternatives. We need to have alternative resources out there. So I'll just plug our own website, will-law.org. And if you go there, you can find our Restoring American Education project. What we have there are resources for school boards that want to fight back against this stuff. We have resources for parents that we're developing to sort of what is CRT and what are the alternatives that are out there. I think that's the most important part, is seeing what the alternatives are. And we also, by the way, have resources for teachers. Again, we know teachers have been indoctrinated into this stuff and they may not even realize it. So the teachers that want to go down a different path, they need those resources. Our project is one part of it. Invite your viewers to check that out. But we need across the country sort of a broader approach to provide these alternative resources so that there are things out there for parents, teachers, and school boards that want to go a different way. Sometimes we find those resources are currently lacking.
Can you give us that website one more time where they can find your report and those resources?
Absolutely. You can find the report and our Restoring American Education project at will-law.org.
Okay, thank you. Now, is there a way to fix this system when it comes to the university system that really does seem to have been taken captive? Is there a solution? Do you have to just rebuild new universities that aren't doing this?
Yeah, it's a challenging question as we discuss the pervasiveness of liberalism across universities as a whole. I think one key is to get more teachers into the classroom that were not exposed to this stuff. So make it easier for teachers to come into the classroom through alternative means, like alternative licensing procedures. Another key is more school choice. We're big proponents of universal school choice, making sure every family has the chance to go to the school that meets their needs. And when every family has that opportunity, pushing these liberal agendas, and it won't be as popular. They won't be able to get away with it, I should say. They won't be able to do it as effectively because parents will have the opportunity to take their kids out of school. So I think getting other teachers from different backgrounds in the classroom along with universal school choice, that's our best path. System, while it's not lost, that's a much longer term process to try to fix.
It's easier to sell a bad product if people are required to purchase it. And that's kind of been the monopoly that we've had right now in the ability to introduce competition into that. And Will, this might be the last question I got for you. It's a couple minutes, but you've used the term indoctrination several times in our conversation. You refer to that in your report. Define that for us. What's the difference between indoctrination and simply exposing somebody to a set of ideas that they may not have previously been exposed to?
Yes, another great question. I think our perspective is that we don't mind if some of this material is taught to teachers. We think exposing folks to different ideas is a good thing. The problem with indoctrination is that this is presented as the one perspective that you can move forward with. So, for example, with your wife, she wanted to go a different path with that work, and that wasn't allowed. We have no problem with presenting a wide variety of ideas, particularly at the college level. That's what it's for. But when you're in a box and you're not allowed to think outside that box, that's no longer the goal of college and presenting a wide variety of concepts. We're now in the realm of indoctrination, where this is the path you must go forward on, and you're sort of stuck in the vacuum of alternative viewpoints. And we think that's a pretty negative process that's happening in our universities.
Yeah, and it begs the question for me whether the university system, the universe, the one verse, this recognition that there are things that are true and we want to try to find it, whether that university system has lost its purpose entirely. But you've done a really good job and a great service to all of us to make this research available to us, do that work and show us how this is working. One more time, Dr. Flanders, on behalf of Will, what's the website we can get that report?
The will-law.org.
And we will do so, will-law.org. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much. Have a great evening.